and welcome to Grand Rounds. I'm just going to commence with a land statement. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. CHEO also honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and their valuable past, present, and future contributions to the land. And with that, I will hand over to Dr. Bill Gardner, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Karen. I actually like to begin at the very beginning by thanking the PSI Foundation, who provides the funding for our series of speakers on the learning health system. We're very grateful to them. We've had a distinguished series of speakers whom Dr. Foray continues, and all these speakers have generated a great deal of valuable discussion for CHEO, so we're very grateful to them. Pierre-Gerlier Foray is the James S. and Barbara A. Palmer Chair in Public Policy at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, where he directs that school. But he's had a very distinguished career in many other places, including being director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy at Johns Hopkins University, where he was also professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's the former president and CEO of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, which is a Canadian institution supporting innovation in policy research. Now, one of the reasons he's had these leading positions is that he is more than just a distinguished social scientist and health policy academic. He's been very actively involved in the formulation of policy for Canadian government. He was appointed to the Royal Commission on the Future of Healthcare in Canada, where he was director of research. This is where the famous Romano report was presented. He began his career at the University of Laval. He's published many papers. And I guess what I would say beyond what I really value in his scholarship and his wide experience is also a man of great culture. I mean, I would just describe myself as a kind of technician, and I think that that actually coming to grips with deep issues in health policy requires the kind of grasp of literature, philosophy, and the humanities that really distinguishes Dr. Foray from most healthcare academics. So I think we're very fortunate to have him today. And I gather that he's going to talk to us about how to have conversations with government about difficult issues. And I cannot think of a more timely thing, since I would like to get hold of many government officials right now and have some difficult conversations. So I'm looking for guidance from Pierre on how to do this. Thank you, Dr. Foray.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'm of course very grateful for your invitation, and yeah, I must say I look at this presentation this morning in a way, you know, there cannot be a worse moment to have this conversation, especially with your group. You know, last year we canceled this event in large part because of the wave 1 of the pandemic. This time we are, you know, in probably even the worst moment in the history of this particular public health crisis, and so I feel in a way that I would rather have a conversation about what you're experiencing, that, you know, about my own trajectory through policy making and policy development, which is the topic of my presentation this morning. But again, I'm very grateful for what you're doing and very humbled by this invitation. I will try to share my screen if you don't mind, because I would like to show you a few slides. People in this group that have now experienced what the ordeal of making a presentation on Zoom know what it is. You're basically saying a collection of small black post stamps where you have the name of people, and you don't know what they think, you don't know what they're doing when you're talking, and of course there is no interaction with the group. This is the way we live now, and of course I would prefer, as you could imagine, if I were present and be able to interact with you in person. So let's try this. Can you see the slide now? Excellent. So what I will try to do this morning, as I just said, is that I will try to walk you through my own thinking about, again, as Bill said, I spend a life with one foot in policy making and one foot in academia. And so this is more or less the result of my thinking about what it is actually to work in policy, and in particular, because I'm a health policy person, what it is to work in health policy. And I hope through that I will bring a better understanding of this world from the viewpoint of someone that for different reasons has been involved in the, as one journalist was telling me last week, about every important health reform that has taken place in this country for the last 20 years. I'm a footnote, and probably not because I'm very important, but just because they always need a French Canadian at some point on every committee. So let's start at the beginning. And my own story started in Barcelona. I was just out of my PhD. I was doing a postdoc in the UK at the time, when I was called by a former students of mine who at the time was the Deputy Minister for Policy at the Catalan Ministry of Health in Barcelona. So Catalonia has about the size of Quebec. Many of you probably have been traveling there and at least have some sort of knowledge of Barcelona. But Catalonia is interesting from a health policy perspective because they have done a lot of things in advance of others. And in particular, they are one of the first health region in the world that did a complete primary healthcare reform alongside Barbara Starfield recommendation very early in the 1980s. And at the beginning of the 1990s, when I was doing my postdoc, they were at the time where they wanted to do a first evaluation of their reform of their primary healthcare. They would want to do a first evaluation, of their primary healthcare reform. So I went to Barcelona, started working with this team. We did intensive work with a lot of interviews, a lot of site visits, a lot of questionnaire, a lot of data analysis. And the thing that really struck me at the time, and was a big shock for me coming from, a PhD, was that there were very diverging results. There were places where the reform has done wonders. You had people working in teams, integration, better care, better outcomes. There were regions or health districts where there has been no change at all. They were just doing their things as they were doing before. And there were areas where basically the reform has introduced changes that for the worst. And in fact, you have a real degradation of the quality of care and of the way people were working. And I don't need to get into the details now, but I found it very puzzling, because my idea is that if you design a good policy, you should see low progress in some places, better results elsewhere, and real success in some places. But you shouldn't see that kind of distribution in which you have basically success in some places, nothing happened elsewhere, and in other places, the situation getting worse. And I start to understand at that point, and it became a very important part of my thinking about policy. And this is probably my first observation this morning, that you realize that for a policy to really be effective, adaptability to changing circumstances, including the local context, the conditions, the capacity, will always trump conceptual rigor. And this is something I'm surrounded here at the school by economists. They hate me when I say that, because they are convinced that there might be a right way of doing things, that if you design the perfect policy using the perfect set of data, it must work somewhere. And the idea that you may design something that will let local actors and local circumstance prevail, it will be terrible. In Canada, we have this debate all the time. It's our debate about federal-provincial relationship in healthcare, where you have people that are convinced that if we were able to have a federal government imposing norms and standards from coast to coast to coast, it will suddenly change. And you have people say, maybe not. Maybe it's better to be adapted to local circumstances. Maybe it's better to have the capacity to be adaptable and making sure that we're taking care of what is happening locally. You know, what happened in Catalonia, for instance, is that in very small communities where they might have had a young physician, and we have seen people literally during their call hours sleeping on the bare ground or on cement floor in a sleeping bag. Those people were providing care to remote villages and areas. The incentives in the act was, of course, to work in teams. So they abandoned those positions and they went to work in mid-sized cities so that they could integrate teams where they will have behaviors and integration into the system that was more closer to what we thought at the time was a better way of providing care. But it creates care deserts in the province that we haven't seen before. And this is an example of the problem of not having a policy that is adaptable. Should we still do policies? Because of course, the question is, in that case, why don't you let just people making decisions? And there are benefits of making policies, because, and this is the first distinction I want to introduce this morning, is that a policy reduces the need for decisions. And this is the principal reason why we do policy. We do policy because it increases predictability and intelligibility, and of course, stability locally. So rather than having to make a decision every time, you basically try to abide by the policy in question, because the people will adapt their behavior to take into account the information that is embedded in the policy. I remember when during the first Stephen Harper minority government, I was still in the federal bureaucracy at the time. Their thinking, I remember once I had a conversation with some people at PMO, and they answer, oh, PG, we don't need advice on policy because we don't need policies. We have values and we make decisions. This is all we need. After a few years, they start realizing that policies are helpful. At least journalists are able to understand what you're doing. The public is able to understand what you're doing. It creates, as I said, intelligibility in the system, and of course also predictability, because people say, we have this policy, following the policy will help us. Second episode, much later. So this Milton Wong that I'm quoting here was one of my mentors. He passed away 10 years ago. He was a philanthropist. He was a financial genius. He was a champion of academy, as being the board chair at Simon Fraser, a major donor and stakeholder at UBC, and in many other groups and organizations in Canada defending science. Milton was born in the downtown east side. and raised there. And there's a beautiful movie that you could find on the National Film Board website about his brothers. One of his brothers was one of the first graduate from the Chinese Canadian graduate from the Department of Engineering at UBC. And when he got his diploma as an engineer, the Dean of Engineering at UBC asked him to come to his office and say, "Congratulations, very proud of you. You will never find a job in this province. You should go back to your father's shop," and he became a tailor and has a career as a tailor. One of the most moving moments I had with Milton, he drove me once in Vancouver and showed me all the places where him and his brothers were not allowed to go when they were kids. You know, swimming pools and libraries where they were not admitted because they were Chinese Canadians. Milton was very involved at the end of his life in trying to rebuild the downtown east side. As you know, it's the poorest postal code in Canada. And trying to find solutions for people there. And I think there is a lot of wisdom in what, you know, he was constantly telling me, what you're seeing there is the result of past public policies. It's not the people. It's not happenstance. It's bad decisions that have been made one after the other that are the cause of what you're seeing there. And in a way, he was rediscovering, and I learned that from him. And later I discovered that this was actually already present in our literature. This is one of the first 3 books that have started the movement for what is called now implementation science. So people that are looking at the way policy are implemented. It's the result of a big research project at Berkeley, led by Aaron Vildoski, who is one of the founding fathers and figure of policy analysis. And this is what Vildoski called the problem of the complexity of joint action. Vildoski, when you look, so their project, they were looking at a big program put in place by the US federal government to help rebuild Oakland after the riots of the 1960s. A lot of money invested, a lot of projects, and as you could imagine, for the most part, a big failure. And they were interested in understanding why implementation was so difficult. And one of the first things that they discover is that, first of all, and it will be true for any of you that is starting doing health policy, you're never the first person to look at a problem. You're always arriving in an area where people have already implemented, deployed, imagined policy solutions. And this is the first problem you're facing. You have to understand who came before you. And the second thing is that you're never the only person trying to do something there. So if you're a health actor, you discover that at the same time you're trying to change something, someone is doing transportation policy, education policy, financial policy, and so on and so forth. And this has a huge influence on the type of work you're trying to do. It could basically contradict most of the initiatives you're trying to take, because they are doing things that are following their own logic in their own sphere. And this is a problem that is very difficult to resolve. Vildoski, when he ended this project, was very, very pessimistic. You know, he said that you will see that if you ever are curious enough to open this book, that he thinks that the actual odds of realizing a project or a policy as it is conceived in the start is probably 1 in a million. And this for only technical reasons of the type I've just described that have nothing to do with the competency of the people trying to do it. It's just that there's so many decision points. There's so many people that needs to be convinced and integrated into your project that in the end you're facing a huge risk of failure. So first is that, and this is my second observation, the reality of policy aims to impact and transform is always nothing but a cumulative legacy of previous decisions and policies. And often the problem you're trying to solve is also the result of previous policies or conflicting priorities. And maybe this is the only time this morning where I will plead for my own discipline, which is policy analysis. That is where we train people to open that black box and understand what are the policies that have been deployed before, understand how the priorities are conflicting, and so on and so forth. The other question about failure, this is a book you may have heard about. This is was a sort of health policy bestseller a few years ago. It's a big project. We worked 10 years on this project. We did 30 case studies of attempt to reform the Canadian health system in 5 different provinces. And you know, normally in front of a group, I would ask you, how many times have we actually claimed that one of those 30 policy reform attempt had been successful? And the answer is 1. That is actually still in place. It's Quebec Pharmacare. And we have about 4 or 5 where the jury is out, you know, in terms of, was this successful? Well, in part, and most of what we have seen is failure. And I think this is a real problem when I think we're doing better than what we have seen at the time of this book, but it's still incredibly difficult to reform the health system. And there are different reasons here. I put the name of the people that have attached their name to those ideas because it's also interesting to look at what they have written, again, if you have time. The reason, so why reform fails? The first reason, this is Jean-Louis Denis' major contribution to the field, is because in fact, most of them are bringing very limited benefits. They are not changing deeply the experience of patients or providers. The change of letterhead might be very exciting if you're a printer, but you know, for a patient, it doesn't change much to their life. And this is what most people experience with many of the reforms we're trying to introduce. And sometimes it's very disappointing because we're convinced that we will deeply change the life of people. And we realize in the end, yeah, care is slightly better. Is it worth doing it? Of course, because it's always worth doing things that are getting us to provide better care. But does it change their life dramatically? Not really. Are we saving money? Yes, maybe. And 1% of a budget the size of healthcare is significant. But it's not 10%. It's not 20%. It's, you know, a fraction of 1% change. And those limited benefits makes those reforms very difficult to sustain because enthusiasm will probably decline as quickly as when people start realizing not many benefits. Larry Brown is a professor at Columbia, a good friend, and his point is always that we are always forced to deal with conflicting options, and nothing is more difficult to explain to a decision maker, that they cannot do both things at the same time. You cannot do Kaiser and Mayo at the same time. This is Larry's famous example. You know, if you cannot build a complex integrated system or a hospital-centered system at the same time, you have to choose. And people say, well, there might be. No, they're not. In fact, if you're trying to do both, you will probably fail in the very end. Carolyn Chewy from University of Toronto has insisted on the fact that we have confusing incentives in our system. The more we have hybrid systems, so systems that integrate elements, if you have a public system that start integrating elements of private care, competition, and so on, you're sending confusing messages about what are the real incentives for people. And it creates a huge issue in terms of implementation. And finally, Hervé Lazare was the lead scientists on this big project. Say, no, in the end, it's politics and Trump. The reason the Quebec Pharmacare took place is because we have a very strong Minister of Health. And of course, it was done in the context of trying to occupy territory before the federal government tried to do its own pharmacare program. Quebec was very, very anxious to move in that space first, to make sure that they will not have to adhere to a federal program. The other side, so this is what the literature is telling us about the reasons for failure. The other reason, of course, is that citizens themselves are constantly recalculating the cost and benefits of their own integration and support for transformation in society. This is a book from Richard Rose. It very unfortunately has never been re-edited. I think that the original edition is 1989, but a fascinating book in which Richard Rose tried to analyze policy from the point of view of the people, from the point of view of ordinary citizens. And you know, most of what we do during the day, this is Rose's first remark, is not influenced by policy. Most of the most important things you have done in your life have been just barely influenced by policy. You know, choosing a partner, deciding how many kids you will have, deciding where you, etc. Those things are decided in the private sphere outside of government. So we tend to exaggerate their importance. And so people are looking at what the governments are doing. And I think the pandemic will give us a lot of incredible illustration of that type of situation. So third observation, whether a policy will happen or not, whether a policy will succeed or fail, will be decided in an arena where substantive knowledge of an issue will be by definition quite limited. Being citizen, being your decision maker, you know, when I work with young scholars or people that are starting in policy, they always have the impression that their role is to bring a perfect set of solutions to a philosopher king or queen that, you know the sector very well, is completely aware of the choices and the difficulties, and we'll see no, it's not the case. It will be a fight, it will be conflictual, and in large part, it will be made by people that don't know much to this issue. Off the record completely, you know, I remember I was chief scientist of Health Canada for a while, and I remember, you know, sometimes we were around the table, the senior leadership of the department, and we have to make decisions that had an impact on the life and death of Canadians. And I can tell you that the knowledge around the table of the issue, the substantive knowledge, was, you know, close to zero. And I came to fear the most when people will raise their hand and say, I don't know much about this problem, but as a citizen, oh my God, you know, and because it was basically, yeah, ignorance, but also prejudices, biases, etc., that will take over. So the question I have very often at this stage is, what is substantive knowledge? So the answer to this is something that I call causal structures, and this is an illustration from an old textbook of public policy that I still find extremely telling. So let's look at the figure on the right-hand side first of the slide first. So the idea at the bottom, as you see, what is called vandal act. So think, for instance, of a bus shelter has been vandalized on the street during the night, and you have an epidemic of vandalized bus shelters, and the city is seeing for solutions. Each box on this figure is a series of solutions that will be probably promoted by experts based on the best evidence they have. Some people will say that group 7, for instance, again on the left-hand side, are people that believe in the broken window theory. And they will have evidence and a discourse that says that, you know, if we were more attentive to make sure there is no gravity on the walls and there is you know, proper lighting and so on, there will be no vandals. On the other side, they will say, no, not at all. It's a problem of policy. We need to have more police patrol, and there's clear evidence that when we increase control and so on. New York has been, as remember, for a long time, basically a battleground between those two groups. You know, between people wanting more control and people believing in the broken window theory. You have people that say, no, it's a problem of behavior. Those young people, you know, the problem of attendance at school, truancy, etc. If we have better school program, people say, no, it's problem of skill. It's a particular demographic. What is important to realize from a policy perspective is that all those people will come to the table with evidence, with a certainty that they have the solution, and that we should develop a policy that will actually put in motion their particular perspective on the problem. What I try to do, and this is something I do with my students, but I have done also in government with my teams, every time I start discussing a public problem, I start to understand and try to even to make visual representation of the causal structure behind it, to understand who will come talk to me and bringing solution. What are the pockets of evidence? And of course, trying to imagine what could be the policies that will be developed based on this question. Remember, most policies fail. We have seen that before. And so your problem as a policy person is prepare for failure. And one of the most important skill of a policy, a skilled policy advisor, is to be ready for failure. That one of the boxes I showed you could be tried and fail. So what will you do? And so you have to be able to understand that you will have to prepare options that are addressing those different causal structures, that you will have to define policies that may combine the benefits of acting on one or two of those boxes, and it becomes a very important part of policy advice. I thought this will be a good moment to make a distinction between policy and advocacy. And they are twins, of course, you know, because of and I let you decide which one is which. The thing is that the difference between policy and advocacy is very often difficult. Both are based, as this is taken from the website of the Canadian Public Health Association. We work on the best available quality. Of course, everything both advocates and policy people do. Both are interested in concrete and tangible outcomes. I think the first thing is, where do you appreciate, how do you deal with failure is an important question. I'm expecting failure. An advocate doesn't. You know, they will think that if we were to follow their advice, it will work. And this is a big difference between my attitude and theirs. And the other thing, of course, is that I think more deeply, policy people tend to be problem-oriented, and advocates tend to be solution-oriented, which also makes sometimes, you know, it creates a situation for very difficult conversations, especially when you're sitting beside, you know, in the minister is in the middle, and you have the policy and the advocate people arguing in front of the minister. One of the first advice I got when I arrived in government from someone who became a very important public servant is, PG, there's two things you need to know. The first thing is never contradict your colleagues in front of the minister. And the second one is that you have sometimes to protect Canadians against ministers. But the first advice decided that contradiction is not tolerated very well in our system. This is a game I'm in LA with friends, and we're supposed we are our hotel is in Santa Monica, if you know Los Angeles, and we have to go to a dinner in West Hollywood, and this is basically where we are. We left our hotel on time, but we are caught in this kind of traffic, which is pretty current in LA. And because I'm a very annoying person, I say, well, you know, to spend time, have you ever played the policy game? Oh no, PG, what is that again? And so I said, you know, the policy game is trying to understand why are we stuck in traffic now without jumping immediately to a solution. And you will see it's difficult. You could play that with your kids in the car. You'll see it's quite difficult actually to do that, but it's a very interesting process. So people will start, you know, well, there is not enough lanes, or, you know, there is not enough transit, or there are enough roads. And then people will say, well, it's mostly because, you know, working hours are the same for everybody, so we should have more flexible working hours. Then people will come into more subtle solution analysis and say, no, it's the car culture actually. You know, we subsidize roads, we subsidize car, we subsidize gas, and we should have policies addressing this. And the conversation will evolve that way. And this is very healthy. And the second part is, of course, to go to solution. And I will come to that in a minute. So the first thing from that example that I want to emphasize is the idea that policy is a collective game. You know, to identify what I've called causal structures, to imagine solutions to policy problems, you need to actually start conversing with other people. You need to find this capacity. You know, your first idea may be that there is not enough lanes, but in reality, you have to start building and better understanding this reality, because you have an understanding that there are many reasons for what you're actually are experiencing. And this is basically an illustration of what I shown you when I shown you the Wood and Gone graphic representation of causal structures. The other thing is that when you start thinking about solution, people will also bring interesting answers. Those solutions will tend to be problem-centered. You know, how do I go from Santa Monica to West Hollywood? There will be a collective understanding, again, through conversation of what is happening. But one thing you know, when we do that in a class or with a group, I will come to a point where I say, yeah, but how do I get to my dinner tonight? Because I cannot add a lane on this highway. I cannot change the car culture. I cannot create a transit system in Los Angeles. So how do I get? And when you're dealing with ministers, you always have to include in your solution pressing and expedient remedy to the situation. When someone is drowning in the river, if you come to the minister and say, I have a fantastic idea for a bridge, which 98% of public health and health people will do when they meet the Minister of Health, they will come with the bridge solution. The minister wants to know, how do you get this person out of the water? And how do you prevent other people to drown first? And then if you're able to build a solution that includes solutions that include both the bridge and the barrier that will prevent people to fall in the river, and a way to get the person who is drowning out of the water, probably you will have credibility with your minister, and you will also convince them to invest in the long-term solution. So this is my fifth observation. Policy doesn't end when politics starts. And in fact, you realize after a while that a policy that has not been implemented is a platitude. You know, policy exists when it starts to be implemented. It only exists at that moment, and by necessity, it will involve compromises. It will involve negotiated adjustment. You will get your bridge, which is great because this is what we all want. But you will have also to include other things that you don't like, that you prefer not to do, because it's the way to actually convince the person who is able to bring your bridge project to completion on board. And this is absolutely essential. So third concept, you know, I have made a difference in a distinction between policy and decision. I have made a difference between policy and advocacy. The third thing is I'm asked very often is policy and strategy. And I think this is why I've made this, put this picture of Janus, it's that good policy is strategy. As we have seen, it is informed by past experiences. As we have seen, it is sensitive to the context. It is respectful of evidence. All this we have seen, and this is very essential. But it also expects the reality to be ever-changing, and it will make place and room for swift and decisive action, as strategy should do. So how do you do that? How do you make sure this is happening? Well, we do it, and I have a lot of envy and admiration, I must say, for this is a thing that the Americans are doing so much better than we do. They tend, when they start a reform, to create agencies that have only one role, supporting the people that will implement the reform. We don't do that enough in Canada, because it's very important not only to make sure that this is what the Auditor General will do, making sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do. Fine, this is good. We do evaluation, but we tend never to provide the support, the intellectual support, the social support to the people that are actually in charge of implementing the policy, implementing the reforms, trying to implement the transformations into the sector. And I think this is one of the weaknesses of our system in Canada at this moment. And I will argue a very important role for the federal government that the government always hesitates to play. So this is where I'm very close to the end. I had a course of my flagship course at Hopkins was a course of introduction to policy, and it was an intensive course of 8 weeks that was aimed at all the postgraduate students in the School of Public Health, large auditorium and a lot of students. And so first year I gave the course, so you have the course evaluation. And one of the questionnaire came back with a comment saying, it was a great course, etc. But, you know, I don't know why we spent 8 weeks. This could have been done in 2 weeks, basically. And I said to the students the week after that I was very deeply hurt because I don't need, you know, basically 2 weeks to do that. I could do that in a tweet. At the time, tweets were limited to 140 characters. And basically, all that I have told you today could be actually captured in this little sentence here, you know, about what is public policy, the remediation of recognized collective problems by way of political action. I thank you very much for your patience, for your attention. I would have loved to be able to deliver that in person, and I'm very happy to get questions or comments if any. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faure, for sharing your insights, experience, and wisdom with us. And I see there are some questions. Please raise your hand in the chat. Dr. Ambade.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Dr. Forrest, for this wonderful presentation. My question to you is, most often in policy work, it is being said that the effect of policy, if you want to realize, you have to allow that policy to be implemented for at least 3 or 4 years. And then after, most of the time, once you implement that policy, the interest groups actually gets created. Then it becomes very difficult to revert that policy. So how you will suggest for any policy advisor to trade the water in those situations?
It's a very interesting question. I think for me, there's 2 questions embedded in your question. The first one, which is the easier one, is that, of course, there are interest groups. Of course, there are people that will be mobilized by your policy. And you know what? This is why it's better to be allied and aligned with politicians. You know, we tend, and I remember, you know, when I start teaching in this area at the medical school at University of Montreal, I was struck by students were always saying politics as bad. You know, it was the, oh my God, it's because of political interference, and we have heard that so many times during the pandemic. Politicians are, well, they're terrible, but you know what? I work with them, I work for them, and I came to believe that they have skills I don't have. You know, they have the capacity to deal with interest groups. They have the capacity to create compromises, sometimes create the illusion of compromise, which is always even more difficult to do. You know, convince the person that actually you're listening and that you're taking their viewpoint into account. And so your first role as a policy person is not to see politicians as your enemies, but have people that have skills you don't necessarily have. So first part of the answer. The second thing is that, yes, this is probably unavoidable, you know, that I came to believe it, but maybe it's just me, you know, that and I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I tend to believe that, again, this is my first argument today, that adaptation is not always bad. You know, we have to live. I don't have a big ego. I think it's very difficult to survive in policy if you have a too big an ego. And I think that when I was bringing solutions to the table at Health Canada, I was struck by the fact that my proposal were always transformed by the policy conversation. And you know what? In the end, they were better. In the end, it's not the case that this interference from interest groups will always make your policy worse. In fact, if you achieve change, if you achieve transformation, if you get people on board, it's probably not a bad thing. And there are areas, again, in our domain where we have done progress in large part because we have accepted that other groups may have a vision of the problem and that this is basically okay.
Jesse.
Hi, Forrest. Thank you for taking the time to present today. I kind of talking about that adaptability perspective in policy. I was wondering if you could speak about kind of that balance of between having a flexible writing policy in a flexible manner and also trying to incorporate essentially having the decisions already made within that policy. So there's a bit of a balance of how adaptable do we want to write this document versus how much do we want to outline everything in great detail. I was wondering if you could speak on that. Thank you.
Yeah, again, a very, very thoughtful question. I would not like, you know, at some point, as I said, even in my last, tongue-in-cheek slide on my last slide, it's clear for me that evidence has to be part of it. You know, the reflection of causal structure is serious. You know, I'm not recommending that we do policy only based on the combination of interest. I think we have passed that world. You know, I think this is the vision it was the definition, the vision of the policy process in the early 1960s, very clearly, and you look at the literature at the time. I think we have moved past that now. I think that there is, a recognition from everybody. Our problem, as I said, you know, as a health policy advisor, I'm reluctant to use expert, but as a health policy advisor, is that we're seeing everybody comes to the table with evidence. So the naivety of the 1990s, where we're thinking it will be easy, we just have to do evidence-based policy. I'm sorry, everybody will come to the table with his own book saying, I have evidence, my solution is based on science. So your problem is rather to start, I think we train, and I'm sure it's the case for most of you, I think we're more sophisticated in the way we treat evidence now. We are able to start, you know, weighting the quality of the evidence that is presented. But so I preach for adaptability. I'm not preaching for being ignorant. You know, the idea is not to just listen to what interest groups want. It's also to be able to provide judgment on the quality, the relevance, and the effectiveness of the solutions that are presented.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Mullins, your question.
Thank you so much for such an interesting and thoughtful and provocative presentation. And I guess I have maybe a comment and then a question. And my comment is really that I think we need science. I'm not anti-science, but I think sometimes we can miss the importance of what you might consider some irrationality as we develop whatever the product is. And, you know, if you take as an example, artificial intelligence in motor vehicles, if I have one and I'm, you know, the passenger in that vehicle, it may elect to swerve out of the way of an oncoming garbage truck to protect me. And that sounds very nice, except that if I were driving and I saw that that meant I was going to run over a small child, I might throw myself under the garbage truck. And I think perhaps that kind of those values components, and I'm an ethics person, are very important, and we need to be clear about those. So I do appreciate your kind of constructing that tension. But really, the thing that I find most interesting, and you're at a very macro level of policy analysis and implementation, but what I find more in institutions quite interesting and bewildering sometimes is that the idea of policy can be something within the cultures like, oh, we have a policy on that. It's printed on a page, it's sitting on a shelf, gathering dust. And yet when you ask, or you witness the implementation of that, in fact, it bears no or very little resemblance to the reality, and I won't talk about hospitals. I know within the prison system, for example, for a long time, or at some point I was being approached by healthcare providers there who were kind of imperiling themselves by providing the materials to sterilize needles for IV drug injection of illicit drugs. And Health Canada didn't want to take it on because according to policy, there are no drugs in federal prisons, except it's a great place to get drugs. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you have any advice about how we negotiate? And sometimes it's profound and really important, that disconnect between here's a dusty piece of paper, we don't discriminate against women here, and then what is actually happening. I wonder if you have anything to say to that. And then I'll give you a Nobel Prize. So.
I was thinking you were asking me advice on where to get drugs outside of prisons. I can address that.
Oh, I'm okay.
Off the record only. So the thing is that where to start. So Friday, I will be giving a workshop where I will discuss this question very directly. First of all, and in a nutshell, one of the things, because of the way policies are used, sometimes decisions are made in policies that, and those decisions are or aren't connected to a policy. So, in part, it's because of the way bureaucracies are structured. So, it's not inherent to the way policy are developed. It's a problem linked to the way our bureaucracies, public bureaucracies, are structured in a way that people at the top are not making policies, they're making decisions, because government are decision-making machines. And so the problem you may have is that the people making the decisions may not be even aware that the policy exists. I remember I kept this was BlackBerry times, but I kept that particular message for years to show in presentations. A very senior policy advisor to the Minister of Health at Health Canada texting me one night asking me, PG, do you think there are people in the department that are aware? And the question was really formulated that there might be other people than physicians providing care and primary care. And I realized at the time, that there probably have in Health Canada at the time, maybe 70 people that could have answered that question. But the problem is at the top of the pyramid, those people are completely cut from the policy level. So decisions are made, and sometimes you're happy because there is a policy. Decisions are made in policy could justify the decision afterwards, which isn't, but again, it's not inherent to the policy process. It's a problem of the way bureaucracies and work, the division of labor in bureaucracies in our systems that are doing this. So I think, again, I will discuss that more in detail Friday, but it's clear that policies are first, and unless they are implemented, are basically narrative, and this is their role. They're rhetorical. They're a narrative that, and this is why they could be analyzed. You could do that as basically a story. To go back to the beginning of your talk, this is something on which I've been working during the pandemic. I published my first paper on the pandemic in early March last year, and I decided to stop after that, to become, very silent, and for very different reasons. And I start thinking very hard, but I think the pandemic has been a test on a few of those questions that are very deep and profound and important for the future. For instance, what is the role of the evidence in decision? How far should you follow evidence when you're making decisions? And we have seen this idea tested, especially during the first months, and it's probably still the case very, very much. So, but if we don't follow evidence, what do we follow when we make those decisions? On what should they be based? And it's a very complex question. There is no single answer. I'm preparing a paper on this question, on the problem of evidence and expertise during the pandemic, because I was struck by this, how difficult is this question in the end. I may not have the perfect solution, but I think it's very important to start asking those questions at this moment.
Thank you for that very thoughtful answer. Much appreciated.
And the last question to Dr. Jabour.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed your use of humility and humor in the discussion in areas of public policy which are so complex and challenging. I was particularly interested in your concept around failure, expecting failure with implementing policy, and really implementation is, as you say, where policy comes to life. I'm wondering if you could speak to that awareness of the probability of failure or the likelihood of failure in actually your implementation process. Maybe that's too much for the last question, but
yeah, it's a pity we don't have more time, because I think it's one of the most crucial issues. I think that how you deal with policy failure. I think my thinking at this moment, of course, because I have to train people and also because I'm involved in concrete, let's say, policy development initiatives. I try most of the time to make sure that someone who is not muted. The beauty of Zoom. So to prepare people to the idea that it may fail, they may fail, to prepare them to have option B and C and D, etc. And I think it's very difficult for people to have difficulty imagining, the preparation of options in policy briefing notes in the federal government, to give you a concrete example, is totally ritualized. You prepare options, you have an option A, an option B, and an option C. It's the Goldilocks approach. You're convinced that option A will not be kept because it's too, not ambitious enough. Options 3 is too expensive. So the options you want the minister to take is option B. They do that systematically every briefing note. It doesn't prepare people for failure. What you need to have is people in the background that say, okay, if my broken window theory is wrong, if those people are wrong, because I have trusted the expert, what else could I do? Because I cannot let bus shelters to be vandalized every night. I need to find another solution. And you need to start thinking constantly about this. Preparing people for that is probably, for me at this moment, the most important thing. And in a way, this is something that I learned because I've been around or within academic medicine all my life, that clinicians understand very well. That, in fact, what I recommend you to take is a clinical vision of policy development, where you're saying, what if I have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I have a pretty good idea of a way of fixing that. But if it doesn't work, what do I do? Do you just say, oh my God, I failed? No. Or do I pursue the treatment over and no? You're saying I have to switch. And thinking that way with this clinical approach to policy is probably something that is worthwhile trying.
So thank you very much. On that note, I'd like to thank Dr. Forêt for joining us today on behalf of the Department of Pediatrics and the Research Institute. Thanks for your time. Again, we also wish you could come visit us in person on this nice sunny day in Ottawa, and hopefully we'll have the opportunities to meet face-to-face in the future. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Forêt.